Penguin Random House Audio presents The Mighty Eighth, The Air War in Europe, as told by the men who fought it, by Gerald Astor. Read for you by Kaleo Griffith. Preface. Rummaging through the attic of World War II in search of oral and eyewitness history, one realizes that the amount of material about what was then the U.S. Army Air Corps far exceeds the collections of any other military branch. There are several reasons for this volume of information. Because the roles of pilot, navigator, and bombardier, the officer component and close to half of the flight personnel required a high level of intelligence, technical knowledge, and book learning. The Air Corps initially demanded a minimum of 2 years of college, and when it ran out of qualified candidates, required applicants to pass entrance examinations. Several of the enlisted men's positions, the flight engineer and radio operator slots, also involved an ability to acquire information and skill. The kinds of intelligence tests given then, and to a considerable extent today, were partially based upon reading and comprehension of the English language. Under these circumstances, it is not surprising to find that a large number of the flight crews had a learned or innate ability to communicate. The fact that all of those who flew combat were volunteers suggests that these were men with some outgoing, assertive aspect to their personalities. Whatever motivated them to fly, infatuation with the notion of flight, the glamour that went with wings pinned to the uniform breast, an aversion to the life of a foot soldier, they made a choice rather than having their kind of service chosen for them. Perhaps most influential was the kind of war they lived. If they survived a mission, they came home to a bed, hot food, showers, and clean clothes. They had a place that was their own, if not a room, at least a bunk with a footlocker and some other space in which to keep personal items. Airmen usually had a respite between their encounters with the enemy, a night at the minimum, or even several days, which gave them an opportunity to keep a diary or journal. Ground troops, while in combat, toted only what they needed to survive, and even if pulled off the front line, their lodgings would only consist of a tent without the amenities that would enable them to preserve a personal log. For that matter, foot soldiers were strictly enjoined against carrying a diary or account of their experiences, because if they were captured or fell on the field of battle, the information could be highly useful to enemy intelligence. Airmen could leave any documents about their doings back in their quarters, safe, even if they were shot down. Because the airmen jotted down their experiences so soon after the fact, there is perhaps less of a susceptibility to the distortions of memory that influence accounts well after the experience. On the other hand, even the freshest recall of things does not eliminate the possibility of self-serving descriptions, and just as eyewitnesses to an event often see things differently, so too did airmen, able to view the action only from their own vantage point, differ with one another. Within the limitations of a single book, it wasn't possible to cover every unit of the Mighty Eighth, and that organization was only one of several involved in the European campaign. That being said, I believe the history of the 8th Air Force as presented by those who served as sources for this book gives a true picture of what the battle for the skies was like. Chapter 1. The Mighty Eighth is Born. Within 24 hours after the first bombs from carrier-based Japanese airplanes exploded at Pearl Harbor, the United States entered a worldwide war in which the flying machine, largely a bit player previously, assumed an ever larger role. But on December 7, 1941, what would become the single largest component of the American aerial arms, the 8th Air Force, which carried the heaviest portion of war in the skies to Germany, did not even exist on paper. For that matter, the entire U.S. Air Force hardly deserved the name, so deficient was it in terms of numbers of combat aircraft performance capability and qualified airmen compared to enemy forces. The Japanese Mitsubishi Zero, or Zeke fighters in the South Pacific, flew faster, higher, and farther than any comparable aircraft in the American arsenal. In Europe, the German Messerschmitt 109 and 110 and the Focke-Wulf 190s could outperform the P-39s and P-40s, the best U.S. Air Corps fighters. Only the biggest bombers, the four-engine B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator surpassed what the enemy operated. But this reflected more the Axis powers' decision to employ smaller bombers than any deficiency of design or production on their part. The inventory of all types of planes available to the handful of air crews was small. U.S. factories had yet to move into high gear, and much of what was produced had been committed to allies already engaged in combat. What had been accomplished during the 2 years and 3 months from the onset of the war in Europe to the entry of the United States was a series of plans that would eventually help shape the use of American military assets. During what were officially labeled United States-British Staff Conversations of March 27, 1941, and became known as ABC-1, the participants settled on a number of policies, including U.S. Army air bombardment units would operate offensively in collaboration with the Royal Air Force, primarily against German military power at its source. In the immediate aftermath of the devastation wrought against the U.S. fleet and the rapid onslaught of the Japanese against the Asiatic outposts of the Allies, President Franklin D. Roosevelt and his associates, in accord with such agreements as ABC-1 and various elaborations of the overall War Plan Orange series, had agreed that execution of the war against Germany held first priority. In preparation for the mandates of ABC-1, before December 7, 1941, an American military mission occupied offices in London. But even before then, in recognition of the ties with Great Britain and the inevitability of a confrontation with Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany, the stream of U.S. observers made their way to England to watch the RAF fight the Battle of Britain against German fighters and bombers during the summer of 1940. They also scouted potential bases for American contingents and managed Lend-Lease deals that included American-built planes such as A-20 light bombers dubbed Bostons by the RAF. The advent of war almost instantly changed the nomenclature from the limited title of mission to U.S. Army forces in the British Isles, USA FBI, and the label presaged the establishment of a significant presence of men and machines. As Chief of the Army Air Forces, Lieutenant General Henry Hap Arnold secured approval from the War Department to activate an air force as part of USA FBI. He chose Major General Carl Spaatz, a World War I combat pilot, respected tactician, strategist, and administrator, to head the outfit, and nominated Brigadier General Ira Eaker to run the Bomber Command. Even before Spaatz and Eaker could begin to mobilize the airplanes to carry out the task, they encountered fierce opposition from the brass in charge of all U.S. Army efforts in England. The traditional resistance of ground commanders to grant any autonomy to the air forces succumbed only through the intervention of Army Chief of Staff, General George C. Marshall. The vehicle tapped for Spaatz and Eaker was the 8th Air Force, activated in January 1942. While the newly formed outfit initially consisted of a medium bombardment group, 2 pursuit groups, the designations of fighters or interceptors were not yet in vogue, and auxiliary units, other priorities reduced the 8th to a bare skeletal form as the Japanese advanced in the Pacific. The original bomber group committed to the 8th joined Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle to train for his mission against Tokyo. Other aircraft allotted to the 8th were siphoned away to participate in the critical anti-submarine warfare off the U.S. coast and for other responsibilities. In February of 1942, Ira Eaker took up station in England as the head of the 8th Bomber Command, but the parent organization was not in residence until May 11, 1942, when the first contingency of 39 officers and 384 enlisted men set foot on British soil. Eaker, at the time all too aware of what little material strength he brought with him, rose to speak to an assembly of RAF guests at an early June ceremony at the newly opened High Wycombe headquarters. "We don't do much talking until we've done more fighting. We hope that when we leave, you'll be glad we came. Thank you." Eaker's 23 words could hardly offend the host country, as they implicitly recognized that 6 months after the declaration of war, the American contribution to the air war effort in Europe had been only money and goods, while British flyers continued to pay a bloody price.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?